So this is another one in our product engineering series. We're going to be talking about customer centricity today. I'll start with a bit of a background to lead in and kind of shape the problem. So good decisions have become harder to make. So traditionally what we've done is in the software development industry or in whatever industry you're in, we've tried to use long-term planning, roadmaps, and tried to predict what's coming. And in today's day and age where things are moving a lot faster, by the time you start implementing the software, the world has already changed. Once you deploy, your decision or assumption is already wrong. So some examples of where we've seen some failures in the last 10, 20 years is in the finance industry with the rise of fintech, and a lot of the banks are having problems now keeping up and competing. You know, in the early days of the fintech startups, the banks weren't worried. They were looking at these startups going, look, well, they're not cutting into our core business. We're not worried about them. Before long, they are. And a lot of these fintech startups are cutting into the core of what banks are doing. You're starting to see even companies like Grab and Shopee with wallets and offering financial services. And the banks were just too slow to move. Another bit of data that I thought was interesting was 37% of software in large corporations is not or rarely used. I was looking at some data on this a few years back, and it's pretty unsettling that we're in this situation, yet we have so much unused software. And extraordinary products. So what makes companies like Spotify, Amazon, Airbnb, or Agoda different? You know, what are they doing? Because some companies like these, they build amazing products that we love to use. What separates them from the rest? A lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them, is something that Steve Jobs said. And something that I think is similar is something that Henry Ford said years before, which was, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So customers don't know what they want. What customers have is they have problems that need solving. And comes up a lot with companies that I talk to is I get this: engineers are scarce. So don't worry about the product or anything else. Just focus on coding. It's what you're good at, you know, is what we tend to tell the engineers. And going down this road, I find so many companies end up in this feature factory mentality where, you know, we feed the engineers Jira tickets and they return code. And our engineers are measured on feature delivery of specifications. You know, and does anyone ask, did the product enhance the customer's life? Did anyone use it? So we get to the reality check. So I mentioned we've got 37% of software being built by enterprises isn't used. And why are we building software we don't use with our precious engineers? How did that disconnect happen? We've got feature factories that don't deliver real user value and produce this unused software. Building feature X to specification Y has no feedback loop and risks producing the wrong outcome. Customer first has become a slogan for most companies, but today what we're going to talk about is how to make it real. So the mindset shift that we need to be in. So we talked about the banks versus the fintech startups before. What we need to be thinking about is solving problems, not implementing feature requests. And the solution of the problem needs to be a part of the development life cycle. So the old way of doing things, building feature X to spec Y, shipping more features, focusing on output, is wrong. It won't suit with the fast-changing modern environment. What we need to be focused on is solving user problem Z, delivering more value to the users, and focusing on outcomes, not output. I call it problem-first engineering is one of the terms that I use. Spotify published some stuff about the changes that they did a while back, that they moved towards focusing on problems. So their old way was, you know, how do we add more features? That was what they were focused on. Then they moved to how do we reduce buffering time, because they found that was a huge problem for their users, is getting buffering screen and waiting for music to play. That resulted in a 54% reduction in stream interruptions, and that's a problem they're solving for their user. That's value for their users. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some ways to implement this. Some examples of how some successful companies are doing it. We mentioned before about companies like Airbnb and Spotify and Amazon. Let's look at what they're doing. So one of the things from Amazon that they've talked a lot about, and I'll put some links if you want to read more about this in the description below, is they call it working backwards. So instead of starting with writing the software and then going through to production and then publishing it to their users, they start with writing the press release that you would generally do at the end. And if you can't write a press release to sell what you're doing to your customers, then why are you doing it? And then after that, if they can do that, they then write the FAQ to describe, how to use things and things like that. And they work backwards until they get to the actual iterating at the end. User empathy frameworks is another one there's been a bit of a rise. There's a few frameworks out there. If you're interested, do some Google searching. There's a lot of them that involve exercises for gaining empathy with your users, which is a great thing. Sometimes just talking to your users helps as well. Just getting that raw feedback from the users. Design thinking is one that pretty much every company that works in the product space that I know does. It's a multi-stage process, 7 stages. It starts with empathizing, understanding the user's need, defining, articulating the problem, ideate, go through a range of ideas to solve the problem, prototyping, testing, iterating, implementing, and so on. This is a huge topic. I'm not going to touch too much on it in this video, but I definitely recommend checking it out. There's many exercises that happen at each of these. They're kind of like little games that you play, some of them. They really help. I will mention a little bit about one of the big companies for design thinking, which is Airbnb. They published this thing about their Snow White project that they did. It's storyboarding, essentially, which is one of the standard practices in design thinking these days. So what they did is they storyboarded out the customer journey from booking all the way through to departing the property, and it really helps. And at each stage, they think about what's the customer thinking, what's the emotions they're going through, and this helps the engineers empathize with what the users are going through. And empathy, on a side note, I think in engineering in general, it's a great thing a great skill to foster. In your day-to-day as an engineer, it's a very useful skill to develop. A good example that I can think of is I've worked with teams that have contributors, and if they get contributors that are only contributors and them themselves don't own a system or don't own some sort of code that they have contributors themselves, they lack empathy. A good example is, when you're contributing to another system, you're probably at some stage going to be waiting for a code review from the system owner. Now, if you're not doing code reviews yourself, it's probably going to be hard for you to empathize with what these guys are going through in their day-to-day, having to juggle their normal sprint work with someone interrupting them wanting a code review. So I think empathy in general is a great skill to develop as an engineer, especially if you're having to work with a lot of teams. Beyond just the users themselves. And an example of this is a pretty common one that's tossed around a bit. So when we talk about empathy, this is an example of a user story. As a registrar, I want to be able to search for a student when a family member calls. Now, that sounds like a pretty reasonable user story. We need to build some kind of search page, right? But if we take a look at what the user originally said, as a registrar, I want to connect a family member and student quickly in case of emergencies so the caller doesn't become distressed or aggravated during the wait. Now, there's a lot of user context that was missing in the original story there. And by hearing it from the user themselves, you get a lot more context. And by being able to empathize with them, you can inherently build a better product. Jobs to be done framework is a great one. There's a couple of my product guys I've worked with that have been using this a lot recently, and some of my engineers have been practicing a bit too. We found some great material on LinkedIn Learning around it. Really interesting way to look at products is look at the job that someone needs to get done using your product as opposed to, problems that people need solving. And, an example on Spotify, people aren't just listening to music. They might want a mood boost or a workout playlist. That's the actual job they're trying to get done while they're using your software. So understanding that helps you customize your software or your application to help the user in the task that they're trying to achieve. So also any kind of rapid feedback loops. I talk about A/B testing a lot. All the big companies do it. If you aren't, I'd highly recommend looking into A/B testing. Make sure you've got good analytics. That's the biggest thing about understanding your users is looking at their behavior, because their behavior and what they tell you aren't always the same thing. And make them as real time as possible. Data that takes days to materialize means you can't act and iterate fast. So the sooner you can get that data coming in, the sooner you can act. Direct customer observations. So guerrilla testing is one of my favorite topics. There's a few of our design guys that do this sometimes. What guerrilla testing is, or how it was explained to me, is you've got an application or a website that you need some feedback on. So what you do is you go to a coffee shop and you wait at the counter, and then when someone comes to order a coffee, you offer, hey, I'll pay for your coffee if you sit down for 5 minutes and try and use my application. And what they say is once you've got about 4 or 5 people and you've watched them, random people, and you've watched them trying to use your application, you'll pick up 80% of usability issues with it. So it's a great little UX toolkit thing that you can use. User Labs is another one. The first time I went to one of these, it was a bit intimidating. There was all these cameras and fake mirrors and stuff while people were watching some guy on a laptop try and use an application. It felt like an interrogation room a little bit. But they're fascinating. It's just looking at what common things or problems users run into. You'll be surprised how much you find out from these things. A recent meeting I was in with one of our research people, they were showing some of the interviews they did with some of our users, and one of our pages doesn't have a search by ID feature. So what the user was doing was searching for the ID using Control F in the browser and then going next page. And we watched this user get up to page 14 before they actually found the idea they were looking for, and it was like, wow, we had no idea that someone actually not only needed to search for that field, but because they couldn't, were going through that amount of frustration. So it's surprising what you'll find out from just talking to people. Technical North Star metrics, I've got another video on. I think it's really important to have the right metrics, and I'll put the link to the video in the description as well if you're interested in checking it out. But basically, it's trying to find one single guiding metric that you can use for judging your success. So I'll talk a bit about common pitfalls and how to avoid them. So relying solely on surveys isn't the best. They aren't fast feedback for one, and you want to get as fast as feedback as you can, but users don't always accurately predict their own behavior. So you may ask someone something, but the context that it happens in may be different, and so the outcome may change. So some practical next steps if you want to give it a try in your team. So I'd recommend small stuff, if you're not already, start talking to your users. Schedule some regular meetings with them. Even 1 to 2 users can give you some valuable feedback. Incorporate a user feedback review into your weekly cycle or sprint cycle. Have a look at the user, and even if you're dealing with users at volume, user feedback can be analytics as well. One of the things that I say, especially about some of the scale we work on at Agoda, is that, we can't talk to the millions of users per day that we get come to our website directly. It just doesn't scale, right? But the way that we talk to them is we turn on A/B tests, and they give us feedback through their actions. So that's another way to get feedback from your users, is through A/B tests and analytics, if you need to do it at scale. But either way, you should be getting feedback from the users. Pick 1 to 2 metrics that actually matter and track them. Put them in your sprint reviews, things like that, and measure the success of your application through your users' success. Tools and techniques to implement tomorrow. So I'd suggest there's some low-cost tools out there that do this for user testing. There's A/B testing tools everywhere. Firebase includes some A/B testing stuff now. I'll put some links in the description to the working backwards stuff from Amazon. And building the right feedback loops. So, set up some real-time dashboards or alerts or KPIs. Encourage engineers to engage in empathy practices. One of the things that we do in some of our teams is we get engineers to shadow support staff. So the ones that are working on tooling for them, so that they can understand what goes on a lot better and gain empathy for the support staff as well as the users that are calling in or emailing in. Join user forums or Facebook groups. Something I did early on, one of my teams that I was working with NHA, it stands for non-hotel accommodation. So we work in making Agoda more competitive with Airbnb in our team. And I joined a couple of the Airbnb host Facebook groups and just started to understand, what their concerns were, things like that, the kind of things they were posting every day. One of the things that they complain about the most is how to fold a fitted sheet. So yeah, it's great fun. And user recordings. So I mentioned before, like the some of our research people, they do interviews with users, they record them. I encourage my engineers to watch the recordings and see the real user feedback about, people that actually use the application they're working on. Final thoughts. Great engineers solve human problems, not just technical ones. It's something to bear in mind, is thinking about that. What's that user problem? What's that human difficulty, or how can we make our customers succeed in what they're trying to do? That's it. So I'll put a bunch of links in the description below. If you like the content, please like and subscribe. And thank you. Have a good day.